The forest was on fire and Rachel Hayes was running straight into it. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he was tied up and half buried in ash. But when she heard his faint, broken voice whisper, "Please, don't leave me," she didn't hesitate. She dragged him out inch by inch through cinders and smoke as a flaming pine crashed down inches behind them. Her hands burned, her lungs screamed, but she never let go because somehow she knew he wasn't just a stranger. And when he finally opened his eyes and asked in a hoarse whisper, "Why did you save me?" she simply said, "Because someone had to." What she didn't know was that this man would change everything. Rachel Hayes had long since stopped believing life could surprise her. She lived quietly on the edge of a forgotten county in a weathered cabin stitched together with salvaged wood and rusted tin. Her hands, calloused from years of mending torn coats and sewing patches for nearby farmers, knew the rhythm of survival. Her world was made of silence, thread, and the soft bleating of goats. Simple, predictable, and safe. Until that day. The morning began with still air and dry heat, but by noon the sky had turned the color of old ash. As Rachel made her way along the ridge behind her cabin, the acrid scent of smoke reached her before the flames did. Then came the black plume, spiraling fast and thick over the Carter Ridge, a stretch of land left abandoned after the droughts. Her heart stuttered. "God help us," she whispered, dropping her basket of herbs. Without another thought, Rachel ran. Her boots thudded against the cracked earth. The air thickened with every step. Pine needles hissed as flames licked their brittle edges. She wrapped the edge of her shirt around her face, ducked under low limbs, and pushed deeper into the inferno. The fire roared like a beast unleashed, heat pressing against her skin like a wall. Then she heard it, a groan, faint, human. She froze. "Hello!" she shouted into the chaos. No answer. But then, another sound, a wheeze low and broken. She followed it through scorched underbrush until she found him. A man tangled in branches and half buried in ash, shirtless, burned, one leg bent at a grotesque angle, his wrist bruised and raw, one still loosely bound by a snapped rope. His face was coated in soot, a thin trickle of blood trailing from his temple. Rachel's breath caught. For a second, fear paralyzed her. He was a stranger, wounded, unconscious, and clearly the victim of something far darker than a forest fire. But then he groaned again, his lips barely moving. "Please, don't leave me." That was all it took. Rachel dropped to her knees, looped her arms beneath his shoulders, and began to drag. The weight was unbearable. Her muscles screamed in protest. Behind them, a massive pine groaned as its flaming trunk began to tip. With one final heave, she pulled him clear just as the tree came crashing down, its fiery limbs exploding in a rain of embers. She collapsed beside him, coughing, eyes burning. But she didn't stop. Inch by inch, she dragged him through the smoke, through the heat, through the aching fear in her chest that whispered she couldn't do it. Until finally the trees gave way. Her cabin stood just ahead, tilted, patched, imperfect. But it was safe. She pulled him through the gate, through the door, and onto the old cot by the fire. Sweat ran into her eyes. Her braid was singed at the ends. Her lungs were raw. And still, as she pressed a damp cloth to his brow, she whispered, "You didn't survive a fire just to die in my arms." She didn't know who he was, but she knew this much. She wasn't letting him go. The man didn't wake gently. It was a jolt, like surfacing from deep water too fast. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, darting around the dim cabin. He gasped, as if the air itself scorched his lungs, and tried to sit up, only for agony to seize his spine. A cry escaped his throat, sharp and raw. Rachel was already beside him, damp cloth in hand, eyes calm. "Easy," she said gently. "You're safe now." He stared at her like she was a ghost. Where am I?" She hesitated. "My cabin. You were in the fire. I pulled you out." The man blinked slowly, trying to process the words, but they landed like smoke, heavy and hard to hold. He winced again, reaching instinctively for his leg, only to find it bound with makeshift splints, wrapped tightly in strips of fabric from one of her old shirts. His arms trembled with the effort. His fingers scraped across the bruises on his wrists. "What fire?" he rasped, voice barely a whisper. "The one on Carter Ridge," Rachel replied. "It nearly took both of us." He turned his face away. "You shouldn't have." "Shouldn't have what?" "Saved me." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for a chipped bowl of water and dipped the cloth again, wringing it out with steady hands. He watched her, suspicious, guarded. "Who are you?" he asked finally. "Rachel Hayes." He closed his eyes. "I don't remember mine." Silence settled like dust between them. "I think Graham," he said at last, unsure. "That name feels familiar." Rachel nodded. "Then Graham it is." But when she tried to check his bandages, he recoiled. "Don't touch me." She pulled her hands back without flinching and stood. "All right, but you won't get far without help. Your leg's broken, your back's torn up, and your fever's rising." "I didn't ask for this," he muttered. "No," she said quietly, "but you asked me not to leave." Graham said nothing. That night, the silence in the cabin stretched taut. The fire crackled. Rachel stirred a pot of broth over the hearth while Graham lay on the cot, his breath shallow, fists clenched. He refused the food when she offered it, so she left the bowl beside him without a word. He waited until she turned her back before slowly, painfully, reaching for it. The next morning, Rachel brought in firewood and found the bowl empty. Progress. She didn't press him, not with questions, not with kindness. Instead, she cleaned his wounds, applied poultices of comfrey and crushed plantain, and rewrapped his bandages with the same care she gave to torn fabric. Quietly, consistently. And Graham, like a wounded animal, remained silent and stiff. He tried to do things himself, pushing his limits, dragging himself up on splintered arms, only to collapse in pain. He gritted his teeth. He growled in frustration. He hated being weak. He hated being seen. But Rachel never flinched. She gave him space. She sang quietly while mending. She fixed the roof after a night of rain, standing on a stool with hammer in hand. When the wind howled through the cabin, she sealed the cracks with rags. When he shivered at night, she draped another blanket over him, never saying a word. And slowly something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something quieter. Something like recognition. One evening, Graham cracked an eye open and saw her crouched by the fire, sewing the torn sleeve of the very shirt he wore when she found him. His throat tightened. He closed his eyes again, not from pain, but from something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. Not yet. It happened on a quiet morning, after a storm had rolled through and left everything damp and glistening. Rachel was sorting through the charred remains of the clothes Graham had been wearing the day she found him. Most of it was ruined. Scorched cotton, melted buttons, a torn leather belt singed at the edge. But inside the lining of his jacket, she felt something hard tucked deep into an inner pocket. Her fingers closed around it. Cool, heavy, metal. She pulled it out slowly, a gold ring, dulled by ash but intact. Her breath caught. Inside, engraved in a smooth curve, were two simple initials. G.E. Rachel froze. Her eyes lingered on the engraving, pulse quickening. There was only one name those initials could belong to in this part of the county. One name that had once been spoken like thunder across every family that lost their land. Graham Ellison. The Ellison estate had once owned nearly everything. Farmland, water rights, even the soil under Rachel's childhood home. Her father used to mutter the name like it was a curse. "One day they'll fall," he once told her, hands trembling as he read the eviction notice. "They take and take, but one day they'll lose it all." Rachel walked back into the cabin with the ring wrapped in a cloth. Graham was sitting near the window, his healing leg propped on a wooden stool, staring out at the distant ridge. "I found this," she said gently, placing the bundle on the table. He picked it up and slowly turned the gold over in his hands. Then he went still. "I've seen this before," he whispered. Rachel stepped closer. "Do you know what the initials mean?" He nodded slowly. "Graham Ellison," he said. "That's me." The words fell heavy into the air, like a weight returned to its rightful place. "I remember the estate, the house on the hill, my brother, Victor. We argued. There was a deal, something about selling land. I said no. He said it didn't matter. Graham's voice cracked. He hit me, in the woods, and left me to die in that fire. Rachel's hands trembled. The man she had saved, the one she fed, nursed, protected, was the heir to the legacy that had destroyed her family. She backed away, her voice barely a whisper. My father died because of the Ellisons, and now one of them sat in her home, alive, because of her. The knock came just after sunrise. Rachel was boiling water for tea. Graham sat by the window watching the morning mist roll across the ridge. His leg was still healing, but he had grown stronger, his posture straighter, his eyes clearer. The sound startled them both. Rachel opened the door cautiously, expecting a neighbor or perhaps a hunter lost on the trail. Instead, a man in a dust-covered suit stood at the threshold, briefcase in hand, hat tucked against his chest. "Mr. Graham Ellison?" the man asked gently. Graham stiffened. "Who's asking?" "My name is Samuel Grant. I was your father's legal counsel. I've been searching for you since the fire." Rachel stepped protectively forward, unsure. "Why now?" Samuel hesitated. "Because the truth is finally surfacing, and I need you to see it." He handed Graham a folder, thick, worn, and bound in red string. Graham opened it slowly. Inside were pages of legal filings, medical declarations, land transfers, and signatures. His own. Forged. Samuel's voice was steady but heavy. "Your brother, Victor, declared you mentally unfit just 2 days after you disappeared. He filed emergency guardianship, took control of your assets, and began liquidating Ellison property. Most of it's already been sold." Graham's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. "He used my name," he muttered, voice low with disbelief. "He told the board I was unstable, that I set the fire." Samuel nodded. "And no one questioned him." Graham's fingers clenched the edge of the table. His eyes darkened. "So he wins. He paints me as a madman, burns the estate to cover it, and walks away with everything." Rachel stepped closer, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You have proof now," she said softly. "I have rage," he snapped, louder than he meant, "and a name that no longer means anything." Her voice stayed calm. "No, you have a choice." Graham turned to her, furious. "What choice? Pretend it never happened? Forgive the man who left me for dead?" "No," Rachel replied, eyes steady. "But you can fight for justice without becoming like him. Don't let revenge write your ending." He paced the cabin, limping, fire in his voice and in his bones. "Victor took everything from me, and from you." "Yes," she said, "but look where you are now. You survived. You're here. You have a voice. Use it. Not a fist, not a match." He looked down at the ring in his hand, scorched gold, engraved with the initials of a man he no longer recognized. "What would I even do?" Samuel spoke again, carefully. "If you're willing to testify, publicly, we can press charges. Fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. We have witnesses who saw Victor strike you before the fire. All we need is your name." Graham looked to Rachel. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "You pulled yourself out of that fire, but you've been hiding ever since." He nodded slowly. "Then stop hiding," she whispered. Graham reached for the pen Samuel offered. His hands shook as he signed the first affidavit. The silence that followed was different than before. Not awkward, not uncertain. It was the silence of a man who had made a choice, not for revenge, but for something far more difficult: redemption. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with townsfolk, farmers, former employees, and curious reporters. Faces Graham hadn't seen in years, some filled with suspicion, others with quiet hurt. A few, just a few, watched with hope. Graham Ellison limped through the door, his cane tapping softly against the polished wood. Beside him, Rachel walked steady and silent, offering nothing but her quiet strength. All conversation hushed as they approached the witness stand. "Mr. Graham Ellison," the bailiff announced. Graham paused. Then he straightened his shoulders, nodded once, and stepped forward. He didn't wear a suit, just a button-up shirt and the same coat Rachel had stitched back together by the fire. No tie, no family crest, just scars, humility, and a voice ready to be heard. "My name is Graham Ellison," he began, his voice clear but not loud. "3 months ago, I was left for dead in a fire. One started to cover up the truth, a truth my own brother tried to bury." He unfolded a set of documents, burnt at the edges but intact. "These," he said, "are land transfers signed in my name, but not by my hand." He detailed the fire, the false reports, the betrayal, and then he paused. "I used to ride this land believing I owned the world, but I was wrong. My family took more than they ever gave. We displaced homes, ruined lives, called it progress when it was really greed." Gasps echoed through the room. He turned to the gallery, locking eyes with a woman in the third row. "Your husband died trying to keep his farm. I remember him. I remember what we did." Then to an elderly man in the back. "You lost your land in '09. That deed was forged with my signature." And finally, to Rachel. "Your father died believing no one would ever make this right." He looked back to the judge. "I'm not here to reclaim what was mine. I'm here to return what should have never been taken." The courtroom fell silent. "I relinquish all land acquired illegally by the Ellison estate, not out of charity, but because it's the right thing." There were no cheers, just a stillness, the kind that only comes when something broken finally begins to mend. Graham Ellison never returned to the estate house on the hill. Instead, he returned to the land, not as an heir, not as a man seeking to rebuild his empire, but as someone intent on healing it. The Ellison Ranch, once a symbol of wealth and power, transformed into something else entirely. The barns long abandoned were cleared out and repurposed into classrooms. Simple wooden benches, chalkboards made from repainted doors, shelves lined with donated books. Children who had never set foot on a horse now learned to ride. Teens who thought farming was a burden began to understand it as a skill. Adults who had once worked this land as laborers were invited back as teachers, mentors, leaders. No one paid tuition. There were no uniforms, only questions, learning, and hands in the soil. And Rachel Hayes became the quiet heart of it all. She ran the kitchen in the old ranch house, cooking for volunteers and students alike. She taught sewing to children too young to wield hammers. She labeled jars of wild honey and herbs, keeping them by the windowsill of her tiny new classroom. Her laugh, soft and rare, floated through the halls like music. Graham often watched her from the old porch steps, his cane resting at his side, though he needed it less now. He marveled not at what she built, but at the grace with which she gave. He never named her in the paperwork, never called her partner or co-founder, but everyone knew Rachel was the reason it worked. While Graham opened the gates, Rachel made sure the place felt like home. They never made any public declaration of love. No speeches, no rings, but there was love in the way he handed her a cup of tea each morning, always with 2 sugars, in the way she repaired his shirt even when he said he didn't care, in the long silences they shared on the porch at night where words weren't needed. Together they replanted what had been scorched. Not just crops, but trust. One corner of the ranch held a field of sunflowers, just like the ones her father used to plant. They swayed tall in the breeze, golden and defiant. "I thought justice meant taking back what was mine," Graham said one evening, kneeling in the dirt. "But maybe it means giving something back to everyone." Rachel knelt beside him, her hands resting over his. "You did that," she whispered. "No," he replied, looking at her with a quiet smile. "We did." And for the first time in generations, the Ellison land was no longer feared. It was no longer closed off or held tight by legal fences. It bloomed, not from legacy, but from love. There was no grand confession, no sweeping kiss in the rain, no "I love you" shouted across a crowded room. For Rachel and Graham, love came quietly. It slipped between the cracks in their walls like early morning light. It grew in the pauses between words, in the small, unnoticed gestures that most people would miss. But they didn't. They shared coffee every morning before the sun rose. Graham already out on the porch, Rachel handing him a mug, 2 sugars, no milk. He never asked, she never told. But it was always right. She'd sew patches into his shirts even when he insisted they were fine. He'd replace a broken hinge on her kitchen cabinet without ever saying a word. They didn't ask for thanks. The gestures were enough. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire. Rachel would read aloud, sometimes from books with pages falling out, sometimes just the local newspaper. Graham listened, not to the words but to her voice. It grounded him more than anything else ever had. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, just the crackle of the fire, the clink of spoons, the wind rustling through the tall grass outside the cabin. That was their language. Quiet, constant, real. When Graham began walking without his cane, it was Rachel who noticed first. She didn't say anything, just offered a smile and kept stirring the stew. One evening, after a long day of teaching children how to mend fencing, Graham found her in the garden, kneeling among the tomato plants. He crouched beside her, brushing dirt from her cheek with a calloused thumb. "Sun's almost down," he murmured. "So are the weeds," she replied, smirking. He sat beside her in the dirt, shoulder to shoulder, silence wrapping around them like a well-worn quilt. The sky turned gold, then lilac, then navy. That night, he left a note by her sewing machine. It wasn't long, just 5 words. "Thank you for staying anyway." The next morning, she didn't say anything about it, but she put a fresh jar of wild honey by his plate at breakfast. And Graham, who had once thought he didn't deserve forgiveness, didn't believe in beginnings, finally allowed himself to smile. They never called it love, but it was there, in every repaired fence, every shared sunrise, every quiet breath they let out together after a long, honest day. It was a love not shouted but lived. And for both of them, it was more than enough. 1 year later, the Ellison Ranch was almost unrecognizable. Where weeds once ruled, wildflowers now bloomed, sunflowers, daisies, lavender swaying in the breeze like a field reborn. Children chased each other between hay bales. Farmers shared pies, lemonade, and stories. Banners made from repurposed feed sacks fluttered above hand-painted signs. Spring Festival, a new beginning. No one called it the Ellison Estate anymore. They called it the Ridge, and they called it home. Rachel wore a soft cotton dress that day, her braid tucked loosely over one shoulder. She helped children line up for their performance, pinning paper butterflies to their shirts. Her hands moved calmly, though her eyes occasionally drifted to the makeshift stage at the center of the field. There Graham stood, no longer a man of suits and titles, but a man of purpose. His posture was strong, his eyes steady, and though his limp remained, he no longer leaned on anything but conviction. The crowd quieted as he stepped up. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. "I'm not good with speeches," he began, and light chuckles rippled through the crowd. "But I've learned something in this past year," he continued. "When life burns everything to the ground, you can stay buried in the ashes, or you can rise with something new." His voice was soft, but it carried. "I used to think legacy was about land, money, power, but none of that saved me. A stranger did. A woman who had every reason to leave me in the dirt, and didn't." His eyes found Rachel's across the crowd. "She didn't just save my life. She gave it meaning." A hush fell. Some people blinked away tears. Others simply nodded, silently remembering the weight of what had been lost, and now what had been returned. "I don't stand here as a millionaire," Graham said. "I stand here as a man who made mistakes, who was broken, who nearly gave up. But someone stayed. Someone saw worth where I saw ruin." He paused, then added with quiet conviction, "I didn't rebuild this land to reclaim what was mine. I rebuilt it so no one else would lose what should have been theirs." The crowd rose slowly into applause, not wild but warm, lasting. Rachel stepped toward the stage, not because anyone asked her to, but because her heart did. Graham reached for her hand as she climbed up beside him. He turned to her and whispered, just loud enough for the first row to hear, "You didn't heal me with medicine, Rachel. You healed me with kindness. And in a world that burns too easily, that's the bravest thing there is." She smiled, eyes glistening. And in that moment, under a sky filled with sunlight and forgiveness, they stood side by side, not as savior and saved, but as two people who had chosen each other and chosen to begin again. In a world that often celebrates power, wealth, and speed, this story reminds us of something far more enduring: kindness, patience, and the quiet courage to stay. Rachel didn't have a title or fortune. She had compassion, and in the end, that's what rebuilt a man and an entire community. Graham could have chosen revenge. Many in his place would have. But he chose rebuilding over retaliation, forgiveness over fury. That choice doesn't make him weak, it makes him wise. And maybe today, in our own lives, in neighborhoods marked by division, in families scarred by silence, we need more of that quiet strength. Maybe healing doesn't come from shouting louder, but from listening longer, from staying when it's hard, from offering peace when pride wants to fight. Here's something to think about. If you had the chance to help someone who once hurt your family, even indirectly, would you take it? Can people truly change? Or do some names carry too much weight to ever be separated from their past? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter here. Have you ever experienced forgiveness that changed everything? And if this story touched your heart, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with someone who might need a little hope today. Thank you for spending your time with us. Here at Warm Soul Stories, we believe the best tales aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that remind us of what truly matters: grace, redemption, and the love we choose to give. We'll see you in the next story.